Hi students, welcome back. Welcome to week 7. Welcome to the halfway point in this course. This week we're going to look at the Carolingian dynasty in Europe and the way in which they shaped the rise of medieval Europe. In the past few weeks, we've been looking at the history of the rise of Islam. We're looking at the ways in which Islam and the Islamic society that develops in the Middle East and in North Africa in the 7th and the 8th centuries makes a claim to succeed the Roman Empire, to restore some of the successes of the Roman Empire, and how the Islamic civilization that develops enjoys a great many successes that support this claim. But at the same time, there are some long-standing limitations and barriers to this society replacing the Roman Empire. So the Islamic world, for the remainder of the period of this course, will be part of the story of the succession to the Roman Empire, but it will remain part only. And before that, we had looked at the history of the barbarian kingdoms that developed after the fall of the Roman Empire. And we looked at their first efforts and we had said, well, it doesn't look pretty. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of instability, but there are some decent building blocks here, some building blocks of what could be a successful society. Monasticism, Frankish rulers, the religious leadership of the papacy. And so this week, we're going to look at the rise of the Carolingians in the Frankish kingdom. And we're going to see how their success, their approach to governing, further fused together these important building blocks and laid the foundations and established the identity of the third of the three civilizations that replaced the Roman Empire, the civilization of medieval Europe. Third, after the Byzantine Empire that we've already spent some time on, the Islamic civilization to the south and the east that we've already spent some time on. In Western and Northern Europe, we're going to see this idea of a medieval European society emerge, and the fusion of these important building blocks into a societal identity we find with the rise of the Carolingians. We're going to see how they are able to bring together and advance these building blocks into a society. So we're going to continue to look at the history of the Frankish kingdom. Now, you'll remember that I explained how the Frankish practice of dividing their inheritance, and this is a practice that's known as partable inheritance, when the inheritance is divided between the different rulers or between the different children of the ruler, meant that the Merovingians, the dynasty that was the dynasty of Clovis, the founding dynasty of the kingdom of the Franks, became progressively weaker over successive generations. And so, while kings and while the descendants of Clovis retained the title of kings, increasingly the most powerful players, the most powerful political figures in the kingdom of the Franks were those who could maintain their inheritance undivided among one of their descendants. And so the most powerful political figures in the kingdom were those who occupied the title of mayor of the palace. Mayor of the palace basically means the one who commands the armies of all the Franks. And so, whereas the kingdom was divided, and you can see here these four great duchies, yes, the four great duchies, but especially the duchies of Neustria and Austrasia. These are the Frankish heartlands, but then you can see there are all these other independent duchies. And so this was how the Frankish kingdom had got broken up into lots of smaller kingdoms. Nevertheless, the mayors of the palace were those who could still summon all the Franks to war. The most famous mayor of the palace, who we introduced last week, is Charles Martel. Charles Martel's great success is his victory at the Battle of Tours. His victory at the Battle of Tours cements his family's position as the mayors of the palace. It means that he can hand on this extremely powerful title, this extremely powerful position, closest to a single unified leader of all the Frankish peoples and all the peoples living in the kingdom of the Franks, on to his children. The Battle of Tours establishes that Charles Martel is able to provide the protection of the inhabitants of this land from outside invaders. This is going to be the root, the foundation of political power in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. In a chaotic, in an often lawless society, in an often violent society, who can protect you, who can take care of you? Charles Martel becomes increasingly powerful. He also supports the efforts of British missionaries who start to come to the Kingdom of the Franks. Now, it's a little complicated to get this kind of timeline straight, but we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. So basically, we find that after the fall of the Roman Empire, there's sort of a collapse in the practice of Christianity and the knowledge of Christianity with these new peoples that are arriving in both modern-day France, or the Kingdom of the Franks, and in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, or England. In the Kingdom of the Franks, Christianity is kept alive because Clovis and his descendants convert to Christianity. And so they convert to Christianity, but as we saw when we looked at the barbarian kingdoms, there's still a lot of violence, a lot of ignorance about how Christianity should be practiced. In England, you have a separation. You have a period where Christianity largely disappears from England. It's only really found in Ireland among the British Isles. And Christianity is restored to England by missionaries who come from the Pope, who come from Gregory the Great to England and help convert the different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. What does this mean? It means that although there's been a break in the practice of Christianity in England, it means that when England readopts Christianity, when the Anglo-Saxons who formed the new kingdoms after the Roman Empire, when they adopt Christianity, they adopt proper practices. They're properly taught by these missionaries who come directly from the Pope. That hasn't happened in the Kingdom of the Franks. And so what Charles Martel is going to do is he's going to encourage missionaries to come from these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms who now have kind of up-to-date, accurate understandings of the practices and teachings of Christianity. He's going to encourage them to come back into the Kingdom of the Franks, who haven't had this break with the practice of Christianity. Christianity has always been kind of going on in this region, but there's been a lot of confusion about how Christianity should be practiced. So Charles Martel supports the return of these missionaries to, or supports the activities of these missionaries to restore the proper practice and knowledge of Christianity in the Kingdom of the Franks, which is a huge task, as we're going to see. Now, these missionaries play an important role because they unify the medieval church, because they bring devotion and loyalty to the papacy with them. How had Christianity been reintroduced into England? It had been reintroduced into England because Gregory the Great had sent missionaries to England. And these missionaries had been successful in convincing the Celtic Christians from Ireland and Scotland to adopt their practices of Christianity by appealing to the idea of the leadership of the Pope. That through the Pope, you can find an authentic way to practice Christianity that you can trace back to St. Peter, who is the greatest of the apostles. And so now you have missionaries who are coming out of this culture, who are coming into the Kingdom of the Franks, and they're also emphasizing and introducing and instilling in this culture the importance of loyalty to the papacy. That supporting the papacy, following the teachings of the papacy, imitating Roman liturgical practices, Roman architectural styles for building churches. This is part of what it means to authentically practice Christianity. And we see that in the life of Charles Martel. 7 years after the Battle of Tours, he goes down to Italy and he helps Gregory III defend himself against the Lombards. Now, the Lombards are a new group, a new tribe that's moved into Italy, started trying to take over the region. The Pope appeals for help to Charles Martel. Charles Martel, who's now has this reputation as someone who has helped defend Christian lands or Christian kingdoms against outsiders. And so Charles Martel goes to Rome and helps the Pope defend himself against the Lombards. This is the beginning of a hugely important alliance. Remember that I said that the three building blocks of medieval European society are monasticism, Frankish rulers, and the leadership of the papacy. And now you see two of them being brought together here. That the leadership of the papacy is going to be supported by the Frankish rulers, and that the Frankish rulers are going to receive their legitimacy, or a significant aspect of their legitimacy, or an increased legitimacy, from the fact that they're seen as defending the papacy. And so the alliance between the papacy and the kingdom of the Franks, which you see really beginning here with Charles Martel, is really crucial to the formation of a medieval society. When Charles Martel dies in 741, he does what all Franks do. He divides his inheritance between his two surviving sons, Pepin and Carloman. However, 6 years later, Carloman determines to enter a monastery. He decides to become a monk. This is interesting and important for a couple of reasons. First reason is that it means that the political power of the kingdom of the Franks is going to remain united. It doesn't get split and split again after each generation. And so this family of Charles Martel is going to remain a powerful family. The second reason that this is important and interesting is that it shows you the intersection of these two other building blocks, monasticism and the kingdom of the Franks. And it shows you the respect for monasticism among these Frankish peoples. Pretty violent, pretty what we might call uncivilized. You have someone who's really at the apex of this society, who can become a great lord and a ruler who can become extremely powerful, choosing to become a monk. That shows you that this society really values monasticism. So in the middle of the 8th century, we now have a society where papal leadership is increasingly recognized, where we have these increasingly powerful local rulers, and where monasticism is highly valued. Now, Pepin the Short continues the slightly awkward relationship between his family, who are, remember, still the mayors of the palace, they're not the kings, and the now figurehead Merovingian rulers. So you still have this venerable line of rulers. They can trace their ancestry to the mythical Merovech and certainly to Clovis, the great king of the Franks, the founder of the Frankish kingdom, but they have very little power. And they're increasingly weak. And so they're the king. You have someone like Pepin who's very powerful. He commands the armies, but he still bows down to them, acknowledges their leadership. But it started to become increasingly silly. There was one point during Charles Martel's life where the king died and Charles Martel just didn't even bother to replace him, because everyone knew that Charles Martel and his decisions were what shaped the path and the decisions and the policies of this kingdom. And so Pepin says, well, I guess we need to have a king, and he goes round and he tries to find the most accurate and the most consistent descendant of Clovis, and says, okay, you're the king now. This starts to feel a little bit strange and a little bit unnecessary. And so in 751, he wrote to the Pope at the time, the Pope who was called Zachary. Again, you see a Frankish king appealing to the Pope. And he says, is it appropriate for the person in the kingdom who has the most power, meaning himself and his family, not to be the king? And Zacharias wrote back and said, no, it's not appropriate. The most powerful person in the kingdom should be the king. And so basically he's saying that Pepin can go ahead and remove the last Merovingian. And so that's what Pepin does. He has the last Merovingian named Childeric. He has him shaved, which was a sign that he's no longer king. Merovingians didn't shave. It was a sign of their authority, and has him sent to a monastery. So monasteries are also a place you can get rid of people, politically speaking, who you don't like or who are a threat. And so Pepin becomes the ruler of this new dynasty. 3 years later, there's a new pope, Stephen II. I have Stephen III here, that's incorrect. Stephen II. And Stephen II comes to the Frankish kingdom and he anoints Pepin, who's known as Pepin the Short. I'm going to talk a little bit more about why this is significant in the next video.